I think you are.
Yeah. And now you're going to mention guitarists. I don't know, I bet. Nothing whatsoever to do with the band. I knew what I wanted to do, and I knew exactly how to go about doing it.
Jimmy Page rarely talks about the guitarists who crossed the line, the ones he clashed with, avoided, or quietly resented. But now, at 81, too old to care, he's naming names. These aren't just petty feuds. They're stories of broken trust, stolen moments, and brutal backstage fallouts. Some of these names will surprise you. One of them changed everything. So, who made the list? And what happened behind the curtain when egos finally snapped? Join us as we find out the 6 guitarists Jimmy Page hated the most. Number 6. Ritchie Blackmore. After 50 years of silence, Jimmy Page has finally unleashed the truth about his most theatrical enemy. The London-born wizard behind Led Zeppelin's greatest hits didn't just dislike Ritchie Blackmore. He despised everything the Deep Purple guitarist represented. What started as professional rivalry exploded into something much darker, a hatred so intense it would define how Page viewed authenticity in rock music forever. The seeds of this bitter feud were planted in 1971 when both guitarists found themselves crowned as the founding fathers of heavy metal. But while Page was crafting mystical soundscapes in dimly lit studios, Blackmore was turning rock concerts into full-blown Renaissance theater productions. The contrast couldn't have been more striking. Page wore simple black clothes and let his guitar do the talking. Blackmore strutted across stages in flowing capes, wielding his Fender Stratocaster like a medieval sword. Behind closed doors at Olympic Studios, the tension was suffocating. Session musicians watched nervously as Page's face darkened whenever Blackmore's name came up in conversation. Rock journalist Jeff Barton witnessed one particularly explosive moment when Page completely lost his composure. The normally reserved guitarist slammed his teacup down and declared that Blackmore thinks every song needs a bloody sword fight. The man confuses volume with passion. What drove Page to the edge wasn't just Blackmore's theatrical antics, it was his complete dismissal of musical subtlety. Deep Purple's Machine Head album was dominating radio waves with crushing riffs and operatic drama. But Page saw it as everything wrong with rock's evolution. Where Page spent hours perfecting the delicate balance between light and shade, Blackmore was content to blast audiences into submission with pure sonic warfare. The breaking point came during a freezing February evening in 1974 at London's prestigious Trident Studios. Both guitarists had been booked for separate sessions, but a scheduling mix-up brought them face-to-face in the same hallway. Witnesses described the atmosphere as electric with tension. Page had arrived early, tuning his Gibson Les Paul in the corner when Blackmore swept through the entrance doors wearing his signature purple velvet jacket. What happened next shocked everyone present. Page immediately stood up, unplugged his guitar, and began packing his equipment without saying a single word. His roadie frantically whispered questions, but Page just shook his head and muttered something about not having time for costume parties. The entire room fell silent as rock's most mystical figure stormed past Blackmore without even acknowledging his presence. Blackmore seemed genuinely confused by the snub. He'd always respected Page's session work and considered Led Zeppelin to be serious musicians. But Page's perfectionist nature couldn't tolerate what he saw as Blackmore's carnival approach to serious music. Every theatrical gesture, every dramatic pose, every cape flourish represented a betrayal of rock's blues-based foundation. The feud deepened when music journalists began comparing their techniques. Critics praised Blackmore's classical influences and dramatic stage presence, calling him the Paganini of rock guitar. Meanwhile, Page was being described as a studio perfectionist who crafted songs like architectural blueprints. The comparisons infuriated Page because they missed the point entirely. He wasn't trying to entertain crowds with medieval fantasies. He was channeling something much more primal and authentic. Industry insiders revealed that Page's resentment went beyond professional jealousy. He genuinely believed that Blackmore's theatrics were poisoning rock music's soul. Every time a guitarist picked up a cape or started incorporating classical music into heavy riffs, Page saw it as another step away from the raw emotional truth that made rock powerful in the first place. The final insult came when Blackmore left Deep Purple to form Rainbow, doubling down on the fantasy themes that made Page's blood boil. Songs about magic and medieval battles dominated radio playlists, while Page was trying to push Led Zeppelin into more experimental territory. The success of Blackmore's theatrical approach proved that audiences preferred spectacle over substance, a reality that haunted Page for decades. Even today, music historians point to this rivalry as the moment when hard rock split into two distinct paths: Page's mystical realism versus Blackmore's theatrical fantasy. Both approaches influenced countless guitarists, but Page never forgave Blackmore for choosing entertainment over authenticity. The medieval madness had won the battle, but Page was determined to win the war for rock's soul. If Blackmore's medieval theatrics made Page sick, what happened next would push him over the edge completely. Who knew Eddie's revolutionary technique would become Page's worst nightmare? Number 5. Eddie Van Halen. The year 1978 changed everything. Eddie Van Halen exploded onto the rock scene like a sonic bomb, and Jimmy Page watched his entire world crumble in real time. The Dutch-American virtuoso didn't just play guitar, he rewrote the rules so completely that Page felt like a dinosaur overnight. What started as professional curiosity quickly turned into pure hatred. As Page realized, Eddie represented everything he feared about rock's future. The first time Page heard Van Halen's debut album, he was mixing tracks at Headley Grange Studios. His engineer casually threw on the record during a break, and Page's reaction was immediate and visceral. The opening riff of Running with the Devil hit him like a punch to the gut. This wasn't blues-based rock anymore. This was something entirely different, something that made Page's mystical approach feel ancient and irrelevant. But it was Eruption that destroyed Page's confidence. Eddie's finger-tapping solo lasted only 1 minute and 42 seconds, but those moments contained more technical innovation than most guitarists achieved in entire careers. Page listened in stunned silence as Eddie's fingers danced across the fretboard like lightning, creating sounds that seemed impossible on a standard guitar. The worst part wasn't just Eddie's skill, it was how effortless he made it look. Guitar World editor Brad Tolinsky witnessed Page's meltdown at a London pub just weeks after the album's release. The usually composed Led Zeppelin guitarist was visibly shaken, his hands trembling as he gripped his pint. Page couldn't stop talking about Eddie's technique, calling it parlor tricks and circus performance. "Anyone can learn that stuff," he kept repeating. "Real guitar playing comes from the heart, not from showing off like some Vegas act." The comments spread through London's music scene like wildfire. Session musicians started choosing sides, dividing into traditional blues purists who supported Page and progressive players who embraced Eddie's revolutionary approach. Recording studios became battlegrounds where heated arguments erupted over technique versus emotion, innovation versus tradition. Page found himself defending his entire musical philosophy against a 23-year-old kid from Pasadena. What drove Page insane was Eddie's background. The Van Halen brothers had learned to play by jamming along to Led Zeppelin records, particularly studying Page's layered guitar arrangements on Stairway to Heaven. Eddie had taken Page's techniques, supercharged them with classical training and pure athleticism, then used them to make Page look outdated. It felt like the ultimate betrayal. being surpassed by his student. The breaking point came during a 1980 recording session at Cherokee Studios in Los Angeles. Page was working on some experimental tracks when a young sound engineer started gushing about Eddie's latest live performances. The kid described how Eddie would play entire solos behind his back, with his teeth, even while doing windmill kicks across the stage. Page's face went white with rage. This wasn't musicianship. This was acrobatics with amplifiers. When the engineer mentioned Eddie's custom-built Frankenstrat guitar, Page completely lost control. He started ranting about bedroom noodling and technical masturbation, his voice rising until everyone in the control room could hear him through the soundproof glass. The session ended abruptly when Page stormed out, leaving his guitar cables scattered across the studio floor like abandoned snakes. Industry insiders revealed that Page became obsessed with proving Eddie's techniques were hollow showmanship. He spent months analyzing Van Halen's recordings, trying to find flaws in Eddie's compositions or weaknesses in his playing. But the more Page studied Eddie's work, the more he realized the devastating truth. This wasn't just flash and spectacle. Eddie had genuine musical vision to match his incredible technique. The final insult came when guitar magazines started calling Eddie the future of rock music. Cover stories proclaimed that finger tapping had revolutionized the instrument, making traditional picking techniques seem primitive by comparison. Page watched in horror as young guitarists abandoned blues scales for Eddie's two-handed hammer on approaches. The apprentice had become the master, and Page was being relegated to rock history. The circus performer had won, and Page knew his mystical approach to rock music might never recover from the technical revolution that Eddie had unleashed on the world. If you thought Page's hatred couldn't get more intense, prepare yourself for Yngwie Malmsteen, the Swedish neoclassical metal virtuoso whose ego allegedly drove Jimmy Page to absolute nuclear fury. Number 4. Yngwie Malmsteen. The name Yngwie Malmsteen hit Jimmy Page like a lightning bolt to the soul in 1984. This wasn't just another guitarist trying to make it big. This was a 21-year-old Swedish tornado who walked into the metal scene claiming he was the greatest musician who ever lived. Page had survived the blues purists, the theatrical rockers, and the technical innovators, but nothing prepared him for Malmsteen's nuclear-powered arrogance. Malmsteen's debut album, Rising Force, didn't just challenge rock conventions, it obliterated them. The young Swede had taken classical compositions by Bach and Paganini, cranked them through Marshall stacks, and delivered them with sweep-picking techniques that made Eddie Van Halen look like a beginner. But it wasn't the music that drove Page to absolute fury. It was Malmsteen's mouth. In his very first interview with Guitar Player magazine, Malmsteen declared that most rock guitarists were primitive amateurs who couldn't understand real music. He specifically called out blues-based players as being stuck in the past, unable to comprehend the sophisticated harmonic structures that he brought to metal. Page read those words while eating breakfast at his Bullskin House estate, and witnesses said he threw the magazine across the room so hard it left a dent in the stone wall. What made Malmsteen's arrogance even more insufferable was his technical ability. Page couldn't dismiss him as just another loudmouth because the kid could back up his claims. His fretboard runs were flawless, his sweep picking was machine-precise, and his understanding of classical harmony was genuinely impressive. This wasn't some bedroom shredder making bold claims. This was a legitimate virtuoso who happened to have the personality of a spoiled emperor. The breaking point came during a charity event at London's Marquee Club in 1986. Page had agreed to make a rare public appearance, planning to perform a quiet acoustic set for the cause. But Malmsteen showed up uninvited, carrying his custom Fender Stratocaster and demanding stage time. Event organizers tried to refuse, but Malmsteen started setting up his equipment anyway, claiming the audience deserved to hear real guitar playing. Metal Hammer journalist Malcolm Dome witnessed the backstage explosion that followed. Page cornered Malmsteen near the dressing rooms, his usually calm demeanor completely shattered. The Led Zeppelin legend started ranting about Swedish peacocks who think Bach wrote power chords, his voice rising until security guards started moving closer. Malmsteen just smirked and asked if Page was intimidated by superior musicianship. The confrontation escalated when Malmsteen began demonstrating his techniques right there in the cramped backstage area. He launched into a blazing rendition of Paganini's Caprice No. 24, his fingers flying across the fretboard in patterns that seemed physically impossible. Other musicians gathered around, mesmerized by the display, while Page stood frozen in rage. This wasn't just showing off, this was calculated humiliation. Page's response was swift and brutal. He told everyone within earshot that Malmsteen had confused technique with music itself, that playing fast scales didn't make someone a composer. The Swedish guitarist fired back by calling Page's entire catalog primitive blues noodling, claiming that anyone with real classical training could play Led Zeppelin songs in their sleep. The room went dead silent as rock's two most polarizing figures faced off like gunfighters. The feud exploded into the music press within days. Malmsteen gave interviews claiming that Page represented everything wrong with rock music: sloppy technique, limited harmonic knowledge, and complete dependence on studio effects. Page responded through intermediaries, suggesting that Malmsteen was nothing more than a classical music student who'd gotten lost on his way to conservatory. The final insult came at the 1988 NAMM Guitar Expo in Anaheim. Malmsteen was scheduled to demonstrate his signature Fender equipment, but his performance turned into a full-scale ego parade. He spent 20 minutes playing increasingly complex pieces, stopping between songs to lecture the audience about proper technique and musical theory. When someone in the crowd shouted a request for some Led Zeppelin, Malmsteen laughed and said he didn't know any children's songs. Page, who was attending the expo as a guest, walked out during Malmsteen's performance. Industry insiders claimed he told security guards that he didn't need to watch someone practice scales for 20 minutes. The comment spread through the guitar community like wildfire, becoming the ultimate dismissal of technical showmanship over musical substance. Years later, Malmsteen's career would be defined by brilliant technique, overshadowed by impossible arrogance. But in that moment, the Swedish peacock had managed to wound Page's pride deeper than any previous rival. The classical catastrophe was complete. But if Malmsteen's ego explosion seemed toxic, nothing could prepare Page for what happened when Britain's rock royalty turned against each other. How deep did this betrayal cut? Number 3. Keith Richards. The year 1968 should have been a celebration of British rock dominance. Instead, it became the battlefield where Jimmy Page and Keith Richards destroyed each other's reputations in the most vicious feud rock music had ever witnessed. What started as friendly competition between two rising bands exploded into decades of bitter hatred that split the entire London music scene down the middle. The trouble began when both Led Zeppelin and the Rolling Stones were climbing the charts simultaneously. Page had just formed his supergroup after the Yardbirds collapsed, while Richards was establishing himself as rock's ultimate bad boy with the Stones. On the surface, everything looked professional. Behind closed doors, the knives were already out. Rolling Stone journalist Robert Greenfield witnessed the first crack in their relationship at Abbey Road Studios. Page was working late on some session tracks when Richards wandered in, clearly intoxicated and looking for trouble. The Stones guitarist started picking apart Page's guitar tone, claiming it sounded too polished and commercial. Page tried to ignore the comments, but Richards kept pushing, suggesting that Led Zeppelin was just copying what the Stones had already perfected. The confrontation escalated when Richards questioned Page's blues credentials. He claimed that Page wouldn't recognize authentic blues if it bit him on his weathered rear end, that 5 chords were apparently enough to make Page think he was Chuck Berry. The insult hit Page like a physical blow because his entire musical identity was built on blues mastery. Richards had attacked the one thing Page considered sacred. What made the feud particularly venomous was their competing claims to blues authenticity. Page spent hours perfecting elaborate arrangements and mystical atmospheres, treating each song like a complex architectural project. Richards was achieving legendary status with what Page called 3-chord primitivism, stripped-down rock that relied on attitude over technical skill. The philosophical divide couldn't have been wider. Page's response was swift and brutal. He told NME that anyone could bash out basic riffs for 50 years, but real musicianship required more than stumbling through the same patterns repeatedly. The quote was never officially published, but it spread through London's tight-knit music community like wildfire. Richards heard about it within hours, and his reaction was explosive. The bad blood reached nuclear levels during a 1975 backstage encounter at Madison Square Garden that witnesses still talk about today. Both bands were performing on consecutive nights, and their paths crossed in the narrow corridors beneath the venue. Page extended his hand in what seemed like a genuine attempt at reconciliation, but Richards deliberately turned away without acknowledgement. What happened next shocked everyone present. Richards muttered something about not shaking hands with thieves, a devastating reference to Led Zeppelin's alleged appropriation of blues standards. Page's face went white with rage. The accusation struck at the heart of his artistic integrity, suggesting that his entire career was built on stolen material. The feud became public when Richards started giving interviews, dismissing Page's approach as overproduced showmanship. He claimed that real rock music came from the gut, not from endless studio manipulation and mystical nonsense. Page fired back through industry contacts, calling Richards a museum curator who had never written an original idea in his entire career. Music journalists began taking sides, creating 2 distinct camps within rock criticism. The Richards supporters praised raw authenticity and rebellious attitude. The Page defenders championed technical innovation and artistic ambition. Record executives watched nervously as 2 of their biggest acts tried to destroy each other professionally. The rivalry intensified when both guitarists started recruiting the same session musicians for their projects. Here's the revelation that will leave you speechless. One soft-spoken American stepped onto the London stage in '67. The game changed forever. Who paid the ultimate price for that invasion? Number 2. Jimi Hendrix. The name Jimi Hendrix hit Jimmy Page like a wrecking ball to his carefully built reputation. September 1967 should have been Page's moment of triumph. The Yardbirds were finally gaining momentum. His session work was legendary, and London's guitar scene was his playground. Then, this unknown American walked into the Bag O' Nails Club, plugged in his white Fender Stratocaster, and destroyed everything Page thought he knew about guitar playing. What happened that night still haunts London's music veterans. Hendrix opened with a feedback-drenched version of Howlin' Wolf's Killing Floor that made Page's blues interpretations sound like nursery rhymes. The American's left-handed approach created sounds that seemed physically impossible. Strings bending in directions that defied logic, feedback controlled like a trained animal, distortion sculpted into musical phrases that no one had ever heard before. Page watched from the shadows near the bar, his face growing paler with each passing song. Rock historian Charles Shaar Murray witnessed Page's complete breakdown that night. The usually composed guitarist kept muttering about flash and feedback, asking anyone who would listen where the real musicianship was hiding. But even Page couldn't deny what everyone else was seeing. This American was rewriting the rules of electric guitar in real time. The worst part wasn't just Hendrix's technique. It was his instant acceptance by London's elite music crowd. Within weeks, every major producer in the city was trying to sign him. The same session musicians who had worshipped Page's precision were now lining up to work with this newcomer who seemed to make mistakes that sounded better than most people's best efforts. Page's paranoia began consuming him completely. He started showing up at Hendrix's gigs uninvited, standing in dark corners and analyzing every move. Industry insiders described Page as obsessed, constantly comparing his own techniques to Hendrix's revolutionary approach. The Americans' controlled chaos made Page's methodical arrangements seem calculated and cold. The breaking point came during a session at Olympic Studios in early 1968. Page was overdubbing guitar parts for a new Yardbirds track when someone mentioned Hendrix's latest recording session down the hall. Page abandoned his own work and crept toward Studio 2, pressing his ear against the soundproof door like a desperate spy. What he heard inside shattered his confidence forever. Hendrix was layering guitar tracks in ways that Page had never considered, using feedback as a compositional tool rather than something to avoid. The American was creating musical landscapes that made Page's most ambitious pieces sound like technical exercises. When Hendrix started playing guitar with his teeth while maintaining perfect pitch and rhythm, Page finally understood he was witnessing something beyond normal human ability. The jealousy turned personal when both guitarists started appearing in the same social circles. London's rock scene was small enough that avoiding each other became impossible. Page would arrive at parties to find Hendrix already holding court, effortlessly charming musicians and journalists with stories about his American blues mentors. The man who had dominated London's session scene was suddenly treated like yesterday's news. Page's resentment reached toxic levels after Hendrix's legendary Monterey Pop Festival performance in June 1967. The footage of Hendrix burning his Stratocaster while playing with his teeth became rock's most iconic moment, overshadowing everything Page had achieved. When journalists started calling Hendrix the world's greatest guitarist, Page knew his reign was finished. The American's tragic death in September 1970 should have ended Page's torment. Instead, it made everything worse. Hendrix's legacy grew more powerful in death, with each posthumous release cementing his status as rock's untouchable genius. Page found himself competing against a ghost who couldn't make mistakes anymore, couldn't disappoint fans, couldn't grow old and lose his edge. The American invasion was complete, and Page's ego never recovered from the shadow that Hendrix's death had cast over British rock. Brace yourself for the most explosive revelation of all. Eric Clapton, the man once called God by his fans, allegedly became Jimmy Page's most hated rival. Number 1. Eric Clapton. The feud that would define Jimmy Page's deepest hatred began in 1964, long before either man became a household name. Back then, both guitarists were hungry session players scraping together rent money in London's cramped recording studios. They shared the same cramped spaces, competed for the same gigs, and dreamed of the same stardom. What nobody expected was how viciously they'd tear each other apart once they got it. Eric Clapton's transformation into rock's self-proclaimed god started innocently enough. His work with the Yardbirds had earned respect, but it was his time with John Mayall's Blues Breakers that turned heads. Page watched from the sidelines as critics started calling Clapton the purest blues guitarist of his generation. The praise stung because Page knew he was technically superior, but Clapton had something more dangerous. The press loved him. The breaking point came when Clapton poached drummer Jim Gordon for his new supergroup Cream. Gordon had been collaborating with Page on several session projects, and their musical chemistry was undeniable. But Clapton swooped in with bigger promises and fatter paychecks, stealing Page's rhythmic foundation right from under him. Music journalist Chris Welch witnessed Page's meltdown at a Soho pub afterward, where the normally composed guitarist ranted about Clapton building his career on other people's talent. What made the betrayal worse was Clapton's public image. While Page remained in the shadows, crafting complex arrangements, Clapton was being hailed as rock's messiah by adoring fans who spray-painted "Clapton is God" across London's brick walls. The graffiti appeared everywhere Page looked, a constant reminder that his rival had achieved something he desperately wanted: worship from the masses. The rivalry exploded when both men formed their legendary bands within months of each other. Led Zeppelin's heavy, mystical approach should have carved out its own territory, but Clapton's blues purism kept overshadowing Page's innovations. Critics praised Clapton's authenticity while dismissing Page's elaborate productions as overblown showmanship. The comparisons drove Page to obsessive perfectionism, spending countless hours in the studio trying to prove his superiority. Page's resentment reached toxic levels during the early 70s when both bands were selling millions of albums. Industry veterans described Page as paranoid about Clapton's every move, analyzing Cream's sales figures and dissecting Derek and the Dominoes tracks for weaknesses. But Clapton's simple, emotional approach kept resonating with audiences in ways that Page's complex arrangements couldn't match. The final insult came during a private gathering at a London recording studio in 1973. Both guitarists were attending the same industry party, and witnesses described the atmosphere as electric with tension. When someone mentioned Clapton's latest blues covers album, Page snapped that anyone could copy 3 basic licks and get called a genius. The comment reached Clapton within minutes, and his response was devastating. Instead of firing back publicly, Clapton chose a more calculated revenge. He began giving interviews where he'd praise traditional blues masters like Robert Johnson and B.B. King, while subtly dismissing heavy rock as a bastardization of pure blues. The message was clear. Page wasn't a real blues musician, just a studio wizard hiding behind effects and volume. The war escalated when Clapton started recruiting musicians from Page's inner circle. First Gordon, then other session players who'd worked closely with Page, found themselves drawn into Clapton's orbit with promises of artistic credibility. Page felt like his entire support network was being systematically dismantled by someone he'd once considered an equal. Page's final verdict was brutal and permanent. He allegedly told confidants that Clapton was nothing more than a blues museum curator, someone who'd never written an original musical idea in his entire career. The assessment spread through London's music scene like poison, cementing decades of bitter hatred between two men who should have been allies. By the time both guitarists reached legendary status, their feud had evolved beyond professional rivalry into personal warfare. Clapton's God complex had created Page's most enduring enemy, a relationship so toxic that neither man could mention the other's name without visible anger flashing across their faces. The ultimate betrayal was complete, leaving Page with a hatred that would last until his dying day. Thank you for watching. Like, comment, and subscribe. Also, check out another interesting video by clicking on the video shown on your screen. See you on the other side.